Welcome to History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here today. Author Steven Ujifusa joins us to talk about his book, The Last Ships from Hamburg. Really interesting book. It's something that you're not going to read about really anywhere else. It's business. It's the safety of people. It's right on the eve of World War I. Lots of stuff going on. So let me shut up so Steven can tell you all about it. Let's bring him on. And here we are with author Steven Ujifusa, The Last Ships from Hamburg, Business, Rivalry, and the Race to Save Russia's Jews on the Eve of World War I. Steve, thank you so much for coming on.
Brendan, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, we talked a little bit right before we started, and there's just so much in this book. It was hard for me to figure out even where to start. So the easiest one is maritime is kind of your thing. Your last two books, right, had to do with ships, the maritime history and all of that stuff. Was this just right up your alley and you just couldn't avoid it?
Well, I've been known about Eastern European Jewish immigration since I was a child. On my mother's side, they were Russian Jews. My great-grandparents came over in the 1890s from Belarus, and my grandmother told me some stories about her parents. She was the youngest of 7 children, and she was born when her parents were in the early 40s. And one thing that she would tell me, she was born in 1916, was that her parents never talked about the old world. They never talked about what life was like in Russia. My great-grandfather's attitude was, we've come here, we're Americans. On the 4th of July, he would always hang out a big American flag on the stoop of their townhouse in Crown Heights. For them, they saw, especially for my great-grandfather who came over with nothing, in the 1890s, by the 1920s, he'd become a pretty successful butter and egg businessman. He saw America as this great promised land, and they did not dwell on the past, I think because it was so traumatic. What happened in Russia, anti-Semitism was state policy, unlike other European nations at the time. And so I felt that this topic, it combined my own family history with my interest in shipping and how it changes the world. And we're currently dealing with many of the things that we saw on the eve of World War I, rise in anti-Semitism, Russia behaving badly, which seems like to be a fairly common thing, and mass migration, people wanting to come to this country for a better life. And we're being forced to ask these questions that have been sort of put on the back burner for a long time. And one thing that people don't really realize is when they think of immigration before World War I, they think of, the people arriving at Ellis Island and seeing the Statue of Liberty and all that on these ocean liners. But the general public really doesn't know, especially for Jews, Russian Jews, how did they get from the Russian Empire to the ports of Hamburg, Bremen, Liverpool or whatnot, and get on the ships? That's a long journey and a dangerous one. How did they get there? What was the journey like? What do they have to leave behind? What were the risks? And that's the story I tell and how that mass migration was facilitated. It was not just Jews, but Italians, Poles. It was between 1890 and 1914, it was the largest migration in human history from one continent to another. How did it all happen? It had to happen by ship.
Now, I'm going to date myself, but I think you and I are quasi-similar ages, but I'm definitely going to put myself out there as a complete dork. As I'm reading this, I thought about one of the greatest movies of all time, An American Tail, cartoon from back in, is that the early 90s, maybe the late 80s. I had just watched it 2 months ago with my daughter. I told her it was one of my favorite movies of all time. And I just remember that first part of it where you have the Cossacks and then they're trying to get, across the ocean and all of that stuff. And it's crazy to just read it, and you go back to your childhood and you're like, it was telling me a lot of stuff. And then you're writing about it here and you're like, it was pretty realistic, except for the fact that, they were mice.
Yes. And thank you for bringing up that show, because it really does illustrate the fear that Russia's 4 million Jews experienced starting in 1881. I mean, they had been persecuted before that. But when Tsar Alexander II was assassinated by an anarchist group in St. Petersburg, his son, Alexander III, basically blamed political radicals and the Jews for the death of his father. And that's when the Tsarist Russia really clamped down on the Jews in terms of what they could do, Military conscription was seen as a tool to basically take young Jewish boys away from their families as young as 10 years old, and they wouldn't come home for 20 years if they would ever come home at all. They would not come home Jewish. They'd often be forced to convert, or they would die in the Tsar's many wars. And Alexander III and his advisors basically said anti-Semitism is state policy in Russia. And it was very strange because other European countries like Germany and Great Britain and whatnot and Austria-Hungary especially, had emancipated the Jews, and Jews had done, as a group, were doing pretty well in these countries. Russia was an unusual case in that they were going backwards towards hardening down on autocracy. One of Alexander III's advisors said it would be basically a great blessing if 1/3 of the Jews of Russia emigrate, 1/3 convert, and 1/3 disappear.
Very nice. Very, very classy, I would say. As reading this, there's a lot of different characters. I want to get to Albert Ballin, who, is a huge, huge part of this. But as we talked about before we hit record, anti-Semitism is kind of the through line. It touches everyone in every aspect of this. And I should mention, it's October 17th when we're talking. Obviously, everything with Israel and Palestine is going on right now. This isn't going to be out until the book comes out in about a month. So Lord knows what kind of changes we'll see there. But it's pretty strange. And, they talk about history, kind of resembles itself and things like that. But there's a lot of it here too, right? Because you're talking about Russia, just anti-Semitic straight up, here's what we do. And other countries are not as anti-Semitic, but there's still a lot in the background, right? I mean, especially, as you mentioned, Germany, Kaiser Wilhelm II, who I'm not a huge fan of. I don't know anybody who might be a huge fan of him, but it's kind of all over the place, right?
Yeah, I mean, Germany was strange at the time because it unified in 1871, and it was under the control of the Prussian royal family, and Prussia was the most conservative and militaristic of the German provinces. And there's a lot of tension between Berlin and the Prussian aristocracy and the rest of Germany, which was moving towards banking and commerce and industrialization. The Prussian aristocracy, which had disproportionate power in Germany, derived much of its wealth from agriculture and landholding. And it was against this backdrop that Albert Ballin, who rose to become the head of the Hamburg America line, which became the largest shipping line in the world and the most profitable and the biggest carrier of immigrants. Albert Ballin was born in 1857 in Hamburg, which was a free city at the time, an independent state. Always had a more cosmopolitan outlook because it was such a big port. But Albert Ballin was born to a lower middle class Jewish family that eventually descended into poverty. And eventually his father died when he was a young man, and his father ran an immigration agency, which basically bought tickets from the big immigration lines and sold them in bulk. He was his agent. He was basically bought them. He was kind of a glorified scalper, his father. And Albert Ballin was very smart. He knew anti-Semitism from a very young age. There was a relatively small Jewish community in Hamburg, most of whom experienced persecution. There were some, like the Warburg family, who were very wealthy. But Ballin made his way in this world, and as a young man rose to become the managing director of the Hamburg America line, and basically was the architect of this immigration policy. And in terms of using his line, using the train lines, and basically his company took control of the border between the Russian province of Poland and Germany, and said, we will manage this crush of refugees as long as we put them on trains, send them to Hamburg, and put them on ships. That way they don't stay in Germany, and we can send them off to America. We make money. Everyone's happy. And this happened in the early 1890s when Albert Ballin was on the rise at Hamburg America line. It basically was privatization of the border. The border crisis sounds familiar. You had a huge crush of Jews, but also others trying to get out of the Russian Empire. They were illegal immigrants. So basically, by Hamburg America line, Albert Ballin, and a couple of his rivals who we worked with, including the North German Lloyd line out of Bremen, they basically said, we will manage this flow. We will decide who gets through, if they have diseases or whatnot, they get turned away, but we will put them on ships and send them to America. $25 a head, it was an extraordinarily lucrative business. And Albert Ballin eventually rose to become one of the most successful businessmen in pre-World War I Germany. People commented he was not much to look at. He was only about just over 5 feet tall, kind of an awkward-looking guy, pince-nez glasses, a big mustache. He spoke English fluently. He developed a lot of business connections in England, eventually became friends with Winston Churchill. Despite his success, he married a non-Jew, but never converted himself on principle. He said, "I could not dishonor my father's memory." But even though he rose to the heights of German society and he entertained the Kaiser at his house in Hamburg, he always had this feeling that there were anti-Semites around him. He always felt paranoid about that. His best friend and financial advisor was Max Warburg, who was one of the leaders of the Hamburg Jewish community of the famous Warburg banking family. That was his best friend. That's who's someone he could feel close with. And I do think he had some kind of heart for the immigrants. He worked very hard on his steamship lines to provide more comfortable accommodations. I mean, they still weren't great by today's standards, but he introduced serving of kosher food on his ships. He constructed an entire immigrant village outside of Hamburg that could house immigrants in sanitary facilities for up to 2 weeks before sailing. A lot of it was for business reasons because it made sense. You did not want to have people who had diseases or other problems to not be admitted at Ellis Island and then be turned away. But I think he was a very conflicted man because although he was not an openly religious Jew, he identified very much as such and always knew that whenever he was halls of power in Berlin, there were people who didn't like him. He knew it. And he had some close allies, but he always felt like the odd man out. He was a very patriotic German, but also worked very hard for peace. He saw Germany as a force for good and commerce, not for militarism.
And one of the people who definitely hated him was the Kaiser's wife, right? And he just tried everything he could, but she just refused to like him.
Oh, yeah. Augusta Victoria was from one of these old Prussian families, and she did not like these shipping people and these bankers, many of whom were Jewish, that her husband was bringing around. She felt that people like these were a threat to the true Germany. He named 2 ships after her, never got in her good graces. He actually made a kind of a boo-boo in 1890 when he misspelled the name of Augusta Victoria on one of his brand new luxury liners. The Kaiser found him intriguing in that he saw Albert Ballin as someone who could help spread German greatness abroad. He liked the idea of Germany having the biggest ocean liners, the biggest battleships, of showing the German flag in places like New York and around the world. And Hamburg America Line did that brilliantly. By 1914, it was the biggest shipping company in the world. Its motto was "Mein Feld ist die Welt," which is "My field is the world." But the Kaiser, and he did have groups of Jewish businessmen who he would assemble at his palace occasionally and talk with. But in private, he would revert to the old Prussian anti-Semitism.
Now, Albert Ballin in your story, it's almost kind of a Breaking Bad situation where he's building this business, he's making this money, and he's trying not to lose himself. And then I see the other side of it is when you get to America, a man named Jacob Schiff, who, whereas Ballin kind of wants to downplay his Jewishness, Schiff violently kind of fights against anti-Semitism where he sees it. Who's Jacob Schiff? How does he kind of come into the story?
Well, Jacob Schiff was an immigrant success story. He was born in Frankfurt, Germany, and he came to America in the 1860s as a young man. His father worked for the Rothschilds. He was brought up Orthodox Jewish in the Frankfurt ghetto. And he basically came over there in the early 1860s to seek his fortune. But yeah, it's interesting that on that voyage, which was done by sailing ship, I believe, in the early 1860s, his father gave him a packet of kosher meat so he wouldn't have to eat pork or whatever they served immigrants on sailing ships in those days. And he took that seriously. Jacob Schiff eventually took a job with a firm called Kuhn Loeb and Company, which was originally based in Cincinnati. It was a dry goods selling firm. There was a big German Jewish population in Cincinnati. And eventually he fell in love with Solomon Loeb's daughter, Teresa, very smart to fall in love with the partner's daughter. And Kuhn Loeb decides to take its dry goods fortune and go into investment banking. And so they moved to New York. And Jacob Schiff basically convinces his very skittish father-in-law that he could make the firm a ton of money as the investment banker to big railroads. Solomon Loeb thought young Jacob was crazy, but Jacob saw where America was going. He saw how the railroads were going to be the next big thing after the Civil War. And eventually, Kuhn Loeb became the financial advisor to the Pennsylvania Railroad, to the Union Pacific under E.H. Harriman, and also served as a financial advisor to the Rockefellers. So Jacob Schiff became one of the richest, if not the richest, American Jews by the 1890s. And by that time, he began developing this conscience of, I have made all this money, I need to give it back to my people and to my country. He was a very big believer in the promise of America. He felt that America was the promised land for the Jewish people. And he began getting involved in things like the Henry Street Settlement House in New York. He donated heavily to the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society and to Montefiore Hospital. But he particularly took interest in what was going on in Russia. He was horrified by the pogroms, by the Tsar, who he called the great Satan of the Jewish people. So he felt my job is to basically make America a welcoming place for Russian Jews. And I want to encourage as many to come over. There was tension in the German Jewish community, however, because many of them did look down their noses at the Russian Jews who spoke Yiddish versus German and were not as well educated, not as quote unquote cultured. But Jacob Schiff said, we are all one people. It is my job to bring as many as I could to America. So he set up a whole network of charities. The Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which he helped fund, would give out loans to immigrants starting businesses. My wife's great-grandfather got a $50 loan from AS to start his leather business. He eventually became very successful. There are lots of stories like that. Schiff touched Jewish life everywhere. He wasn't always liked because he was very authoritarian, very stereotypically German, but very, very religious. He owned a big townhouse on Fifth Avenue, and Shabbos service there, if any family member was late, they were in deep trouble. He did not hide his Jewishness, very devout member of Temple Emmanuel, and was friends with Theodore Roosevelt, friends with many people in politics. But he basically and gave generously to Harvard. He had many children of the German Jewish elite, including his own relatives, attended Harvard. He wanted to make this place the promised land for the Jews. He did not initially really think the idea of a Jewish state was a good idea. He said, why that when we have the Constitution? Why is that when we have this land here? He even tried to get Jews to settle in Galveston, Texas. That scheme didn't work out so well, but he cooperated with one of the German steamship lines, not Haupt or Hamburg America, to do that. But his firm also invested heavily in the Hamburg America line. He was friends with Albert Ballin, and his daughter married Max Warburg's brother. So these German Jewish families, financially and familially, all became very closely linked.
Now, when you're doing your research on this, just to get a little personal with you for a second, you are a Harvard grad. You're one of those very special people. And, another Harvard grad comes up in this Henry Cabot Lodge. He doesn't come off great, I will say that. When you're researching about these people, do you feel like you kind of have a better understanding of their psychology? I mean, we're talking about 100 years ago, but is some place like Harvard, which is those hallowed halls and things like that, when you read about these people, do you kind of have somewhat of more of an understanding than somebody who wouldn't have gone there? Or is it, that's too far in the past, nothing's the same?
I think someone like Henry Cabot Lodge, who came from these Boston Brahmin families, he was no dummy. He got his PhD in history, in addition to going there for undergraduate and serving as a senator from Massachusetts for a very long time. He was a contradiction in that he was a pretty outspoken supporter of civil rights for African Americans post-Civil War, but he was terrified of Jews and Eastern Europeans in general, Southern Europeans coming to the country. I think he saw what was happening on the other side of Beacon Hill, where a lot of his compatriots lived, and those were immigrant areas. He's like, oh my God, what are these people doing here? And I think he was also, on one hand, he put off a very confident, assured, aristocratic aura, but I think he was just scared. I think he was scared of losing people like him losing power. And he was founder of the Immigration Restriction League, along with several other Boston of Brahmins, which was unfortunate that a lot of this began at Harvard. I think they began buying into the scientific racism that Jews, Italians, or whatnot were going to ruin the genetic stock of this country. He did not see them as people who would be good Americans. He did basically say in one letter, an Indian or a Hindu, even if he went to Oxford or Cambridge, would still be a Hindu, stuff like that. Or you can't remake someone. Basically, they are who they born. I think he looked at someone like himself as the ideal American, and my forebears produced me, but the guys on the north side of Beacon Hill, they'll never rise to be what I am. And it was a very narrow, very, I think, frightened view of the world. But unfortunately, these people had a lot of social and political clout. And what they did was they took immigration restriction, and it went from kind of a fringe movement among very wealthy people, a small group of people, Henry Cabot Lodge, author Owen Wister, and others. And eventually what they did was say, let's take this out of the elite world of Boston and New York and make it a mass movement. We will lobby Congress. We will take our money to do that. We will write newspaper articles. We will make this a mass movement. People thought a lot of them were loony in the 1890s, but by 1910, this stuff began catching on. President Eliot of Harvard was virulently against these people, even though he was of their social class. And he was close friends with Jacob Schiff. They vacationed together, and they were part of the liberal immigration. So you had this sort of battle at the top of these institutions. There was one quote from Francis Mesa Walker, who was also of that class, and he was president of MIT, and he said, "These are beaten men from beaten races who will have lost the struggle for existence. They are different from immigrants in olden times." The thinking was these people will not change. They cannot be assimilated. They cannot attain what we, us Bostonians and New Yorkers of a certain class, have achieved.
Well, thank God we've completely fixed any immigration issues that we have had in the United States. That's all done now. This is all in the past. I can't help but thinking, as you're reading through this, and I look at Albert Ballin, I both think he's a genius and he's out of his damn mind, because he's the middleman, and all there is all around him are problems that are going to put him in the poorhouse. You have, on the American side, fights over immigration. You don't know which way that's going to go. Also, at any point in this line, if somebody gets sick, they're going to get blamed. It's going to be the Jewish folks coming in. It's their fault. You have Russia deciding, maybe we'll let people go, maybe we won't. And then you have Germany, which doesn't want anybody. I mean, it's kind of insane that he was even successful for a week, right?
I think he always realized, even though his company was extraordinarily successful and he became a millionaire many times over, he had this fear that it would all be taken away if something goes wrong. In 1893, there was a cholera epidemic that started on one of his ships that was arriving in New York. And it started actually in Hamburg. It was from the ship taking on bad drinking water from the Elbe River. And that got a bunch of people sick. A number of people died waiting outside of New York City, and their bodies were thrown overboard, and people were quarantined. It was horrible. And magazines at the time, in reaction to all these liners, these big liners waiting outside, anchored outside of New York Harbor with all these sick people on them, one magazine, I forgot which one, basically called this the Asiatic Scourge, basically. And it showed like these, immigrants, either they look German or Jewish or whatever, caricatures, like they're coming and they're bringing disease with them. And he knew that would put him out of business, and that stoked anti-immigration feeling. That's one of the reasons why he built the immigration village, was to prevent these sort of to have fumigation centers and to not have people sent back at steamship expense. It was not all humanitarian. His biggest fear was if Germany and England got into a war, that would be the end of it. So he worked very hard behind the scenes to stop the war. When Germany and Great Britain finally declared war on each other, Ballin broke down and cried, "My life's work is ruined." He knew what was going to happen. He knew that the shipping lines were going to get cut off. people would be stranded. It was a disaster for Hamburg, for Hamburg America Line. He also said, if I did not have steerage, I would be out of business in a week. Like first class and second class and cargo did not pay enough to keep the lines going. It was stuffing 1,000 or 2,000 people into the bottoms of these big liners. As one maritime historian put it very brilliantly, the late Frank Brainerd said, first class on the big ocean liners of pre-World War I, they had the most beautiful cabins, the grandest public rooms. But he said 4/5 of the people on these ships were crammed into 1/3 of the space as immigrants. They paid for these great liners.
Now this, you know what, you just explained a boat and you described it very well. It's making me think of something, the name of a boat. Oh yeah, didn't the Titanic happen around here? Now it wasn't one of Ballin's boats, but it had an effect on his business, right?
Yeah, the Titanic was actually owned it was owned by the White Star Line when we think of her as a British ship. But a lot of people don't really remember that the White Star Line had been purchased outright by J.P. Morgan's International Mercantile Marine Group. So she was actually wholly American-owned. And she and her two sisters, Olympic and Britannic, were built as a response to the Hamburg America Line and the German ships really leaping ahead of the curve in terms of speed, size, and luxury. They were built as a reaction to that. And one thing that the Titanic had is that she didn't have as many steerage berths as the German liners, but the White Star Line tried to make steerage a lot more comfortable than on previous ships. If you've seen the movie, it doesn't look all that great, but it was considered to be a leap forward because on earlier ships for third class, you had these vast open dormitories with no privacy. And it was really very unpleasant, especially for families. The White Star Line introduced private cabins for third class families and actual waiters in the dining room. That was flush toilets and electric lights. These immigrants had never seen stuff like this in their shuttles in Europe or Italy or Scandinavia. It was incredible. But Ballin followed the construction of the Titanic and her sisters. And it was actually Ballin who also on the upper end introduced state-of-the-art luxury on his ships. He did a partnership with the Ritz-Carlton company in Paris and London to cater a special first-class restaurant on his ships. I mean, he loved the nice things in life. He loved good food, even though he like a lot of people who were brought up very poor, he savored his success. The sinking of the Titanic in 1912, there are a number of prominent Jews in first class who perished. But the sinking of the Titanic really unified the Jewish community on both sides of the Atlantic, of the German and the Russian side, because both had lost people. And Albert Ballin basically said, this cannot happen on one of my ships. He really emphasized safety in other vessels.
And I mean, this entire time, it was keeping up with the Joneses as far as ships were concerned. It seemed like just every few years, you had to build that bigger ship, that better ship, that as soon as one was starting to make you money, it's almost like they had to already start thinking about what's the next ship going to look like, how big is it going to be, and start doing all the math.
Allen's built 3 ships between 1912 and 1914, one of which was never finished and never sailed under his company. But these ships were bigger than the Titanic. They were the Imperator, the Vaterland, and the Bismarck. And these 3 vessels were over 50,000 tons and could each carry 2,500 immigrants. I mean, these were meant to devastate the British competition. And Hamburg America Line had a very clear advantage. They had the rail connection to Russia and Austria-Hungary. That's where mostly Jewish immigrants are coming from. It was a pain in the neck for Jews and other Europeans to take the British ships because they had to go to Liverpool or maybe go to France. They had the most direct and most profitable route. And that's what made Hamburg America Line so profitable. It also subjected Ballin to attacks by members of the German Jewish community who called him an exploiter of his own people. Basically, you are profiting from the misery of these immigrants. They need to be treated better. And there was a petition sent from one of the basically refugee camps on the Polish-German border that basically said, Mr. Ballin, do you know that how terrible the conditions are? Don't you know that women are being raped? Don't you know that people are being beaten and the tears that are being shed from these refugee camps are enough to float you on your next yacht trip? He was suffered a lot of condemnation from the German Jewish community. He was loathed by the far right anti-Semitic movements in Germany. And he was also loathed by social democrats, by people on the left who saw him as an evil capitalist. So he was really trying to thread his way through some pretty rough waters. I don't think he ever really, he loved his family. He had a wife and an adopted daughter who he adored dearly. And he had a close friend in Max Warburg, his financial advisor and member of the Warburg family. But I think those are the only people he really felt at home with, because I think he felt on edge despite his success.
If you go to Germany right now, would most people even know his name? And if they did know his name, how is he thought of in Germany today, if at all?
He is mostly known in Hamburg, which has made a tremendous effort to revive his name and his legacy. In the 1930s, everything that was connected with Albert Ballin was wiped clean by the Nazis. The Hamburg America line was Aryanized. Max Warburg, his old friend, was thrown off the board for being a Jew. And Max Warburg got up and gave a talk and said, I cannot imagine that this line that was grown to greatness by a proud Jew is now flying the swastika from its yardarms. And he just gave this thunderous speech when he was supposed to resign. And the Nazified board's response was to rename a ship that had been named in Albert Ballin's honor in 1923 and rename her Hansa. So starting in the 60s, Hamburg began really trying to play up the Ballin legacy as someone who really, without him, he invented the modern cruise. He basically made immigration to a business. Without him, mass immigration would not have happened. And the street in front of the old Hamburg America line headquarters, now the Hapag Lloyd headquarters. So if you see those containers everywhere, Hapag Lloyd is Albert Ballin's company. They have renamed that street the Ballendam. In my research, I got to know a gentleman named Klaus Budelmann, who's head of the Berenberg Bank in Hamburg, and he was the one who helped grant me access to the Hapag Lloyd papers and to the Warburg papers, which were sealed. Basically, he and a bunch of business leaders want to make his name better known. There's a museum of immigration, the Ballenstadt Museum, which is located in what's left of the old immigration village. A lot of it was destroyed during the war. And Hamburg makes a very big point of being the biggest exit point of immigrants from Europe before World War I. They are now very proud of that legacy. And I think my hope is to make Albert Ballin known on both sides of the Atlantic, because without him, my forebears and many people's forebears, Jewish or non-Jewish, would not be here.
Now, if I could go back, if I could pull somebody from this book, resurrect them, sit them in front of you, and promise you that they will tell you the truth, who would you want to interview if you had that chance? Anybody from this book, who would you say, this is the person I'd really love to talk to and really get some answers?
That's a very good question. I mean, there's so many of them. I would definitely want to ask Albert Ballin about what his ultimate goal was. If World War I had not gotten in the way, could Germany have been a force for good? And I would ask him, in your heart of hearts, did you ever feel at home despite all of your success? What advice would you give someone trying to navigate multiple worlds? And I think that's one thing we're dealing with today, is that we see things in so many ways in black and white, in terms of black and white and identity. I think Albert Ballin is much more like most people. They're trying to navigate various worlds and try to do it in certain ways. And I think his life is a lesson. He died in 1918, just before the armistice. And I think he might have had a sense of what was going to happen. I think he knew that Germany was going to take a very sour turn. The question I would like to ask him is, like, how do you feel about all these people, these Jewish co-religionists of yours who are trying to escape to a better life? Is this strictly business, or do you want to help them have a better life?
There are these wonderful people, but they're very misguided, and they think reading history is boring, okay? So I grab one of those people, I sit them down in front of you, and they say, I don't like history. History is boring. That's a class I had to take in high school. I'm done with it. They say, why should I read The Last Ships from Hamburg? What would you say?
You want some explanation about what's going on now and how history rhymes, if not repeats itself. You have to read history, because I don't think human nature changes all that much. You might not like history, but almost everyone is fascinated by human nature. And if you are fascinated by human nature, you have to understand history. We have gone from in the past 120 years, from steamships and cars that crank up to phones that can transmit news around the world in seconds. But I don't think human nature changes all that much. And when people and nations feel under threat, they act in similar ways, or in groups feel under threat. I think we can see patterns. If you're interested in what's going on in Israel and Palestine, what's going on with the war in Ukraine, and what's going on with Russia, you have to understand that countries and people have deep memories that go back multiple generations. There is something kind of ironic about a Jewish comedian who's president of Ukraine standing up to the new czar. Where do these currents of anti-Semitism and nationalism, where do they come from? They don't just materialize out of nowhere. They don't just materialize from Facebook or Twitter. They come from somewhere. They come from historical patterns in our own psyche, what our grandparents and great-grandparents felt. Where do these fears come from? I think if you want to understand human nature and why people act the way they do, and often we're like, why are they doing that? That's crazy. You have to understand history.
Steve, couldn't agree more. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you so much, Brendan. Appreciate it.
And that's it for this episode. Steven, thank you so much for coming on. The Last Ships from Hamburg. Go out and get it, nerds. It's super cool. In the meantime, hit us up. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Leave us comments. Listen to other episodes of the podcast. Tell your friends. Rate us 5 stars, please. Until next time, nerds, stay cool.